There are places the maps forgot, places where the snow falls silently over secrets buried for generations, where the wind carries voices that were never allowed to speak. This is the story of the Russian ghosts of war, the prisoners who vanished into a system designed to erase them, and the truth that nations conspired to keep hidden. Behind the Iron Curtain, beyond the celebrated narratives of victory and liberation, lies a darker chapter of the Second World War, one written in invisible ink, in documents marked classified, in graves without names. The Soviet prisoner system wasn't just about detention, it was about disappearance, about transforming human beings into ghosts while they still drew breath. Imagine the Siberian winter, temperatures so cold that breath freezes before it leaves your mouth, wooden barracks barely standing against winds that cut like blades, watchtowers overlooking a landscape where escape means death, not from bullets, but from the merciless cold itself. These camps stretched across the Soviet Empire like a hidden archipelago, connected by rail lines that carried human cargo into oblivion, places with names that meant nothing to the outside world, Kolyma, Vorkuta, Magadan, coordinates on maps that were themselves classified. The system began long before the war, but the conflict transformed it into something unprecedented, a machine that consumed not just enemies, but anyone who became inconvenient to the narrative the state wanted to tell. When the Red Army swept westward in the final years of the war, it captured millions. German soldiers, certainly, but also Polish resistance fighters who had fought against the Nazis, Baltic civilians accused of collaboration, even Allied airmen whose planes went down in Soviet-controlled territory, all disappeared into the same system. The official records tell one story, carefully constructed, meticulously sanitized, but the documents that survive tell another. In archives opened decades later, researchers found something chilling, not just the evidence of crimes, but the evidence of erasure, systematic, deliberate, bureaucratic. Lists of prisoners with their names crossed out, files marked for destruction, entire camps whose existence was denied even as they operated for years. This wasn't just imprisonment, it was the industrialization of forgetting. Consider the filtration camps, a Soviet innovation that revealed the paranoia at the heart of the system. When Soviet soldiers returned from German captivity, they weren't welcomed home as heroes, they were treated as suspects, potential traitors contaminated by exposure to the West. These men, who had survived the horror of German prisoner of war camps, who had endured starvation and brutality, came home to interrogation, suspicion, and often transferred to Soviet camps, trading one barbed wire fence for another. The psychological torture was exquisite. Imagine surviving years of captivity, dreaming of home, only to be told that your suffering made you unreliable, that your survival itself was evidence of collaboration. Many never saw their families again, sent directly from German camps to Soviet gulags, their relatives told they had died in combat, their true fates buried in files marked secret, sometimes for 70 years. But the system consumed more than just returning soldiers. It devoured witnesses. Anyone who had seen too much, who knew uncomfortable truths about how the war was actually fought. Allied prisoners presented a particularly delicate problem. American and British airmen who had been liberated by the Red Army, who had seen the conditions in Soviet-controlled territory, who might tell stories that contradicted the official narrative of glorious liberation. Some were held for months, even years, beyond the official end of the war, their governments quietly negotiating for their return, but never loudly enough to disturb the fragile alliance that was already cracking into the Cold War. Documents declassified in the 1990s revealed what families had suspected for decades. Their missing loved ones hadn't died in combat, they had vanished into a system that refused to acknowledge their existence. The bureaucracy of disappearance was meticulous, every prisoner documented, catalogued, tracked through a system of cards and files that would have impressed any modern database, but the purpose wasn't accountability, it was control. Control over life. Control over death, and most importantly, control over memory. Survivors who eventually returned, decades later in some cases, spoke of the psychological torture of being erased, of having their identities systematically dismantled, of becoming nothing but a number in a system that treated them as already dead. They described interrogations that lasted for hours, days, designed not to extract information, but to break the will, to create versions of the past that served the state's narrative, to transform victims into perpetrators in their own stories. The camps themselves were studies in dehumanization, not through random cruelty, but through systematic degradation, the erosion of identity through cold, through hunger, through the grinding routine of forced labor that served no purpose except to wear down the soul. Work quotas impossible to meet, rations calibrated to keep prisoners on the edge of starvation, medical care withheld until death seemed merciful. This was a system engineered to consume lives slowly, to extract every possible hour of labor before discarding the broken remains. And when prisoners died, as hundreds of thousands did, they were buried in unmarked graves, or sometimes not buried at all, bodies left in the permafrost that would preserve them like archaeological specimens of a crime no one wanted to investigate. The Katyn Forest revelation in 1943 showed the world what Soviet authorities were capable of. 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals executed and buried in mass graves. But even after that horror was exposed, the system continued, because the war provided perfect cover for atrocities. Every nation involved in the war had secrets to keep, inconvenient truths about what they had done, what they had allowed, what they had deliberately ignored, and so a conspiracy of silence formed, not through explicit agreement, but through mutual interest in moving forward without looking back too carefully. American and British officials knew that Allied prisoners were being held. They knew that repatriated Soviet citizens were being sent to camps. They knew, and they made calculations about what truths were worth pursuing and what truths might threaten more important strategic interests. The Cold War that followed made those calculations even more explicit. Both sides cultivated useful amnesia about wartime cooperation. Both sides found it convenient to let certain stories remain untold. For the survivors, those who eventually emerged from the camps, the greatest torture wasn't what they had endured, it was the inability to speak about it. Families who didn't want to hear, officials who didn't want to know, a society that had moved on to new narratives and had no room for uncomfortable memories. Many carried their stories to their graves, never having spoken them aloud, the trauma compounded by the silence forced upon them, becoming their own living ghosts, present in body but absent in history. Their children and grandchildren searched for decades, following paper trails that often led nowhere, fighting bureaucracies that claimed records were lost, destroyed, never existed, encountering walls of denial that were themselves a form of continuing imprisonment. Only when the Soviet Union collapsed did some of those walls begin to crack. Archives opened, partially, grudgingly, revealing fragments of the truth, enough to confirm what families had suspected, but often not enough to provide complete answers. Mass graves were discovered, identified, sometimes, in forests that had long since grown over the evidence, in fields that had been plowed for decades above the bones of the forgotten. But even now, more than 70 years after the war ended, the full truth remains elusive. Some archives stay closed, some documents were genuinely destroyed, and some secrets died with the people who kept them. The camps themselves, most of them, are gone, wooden barracks rotted away, fences torn down, nature reclaiming land that once held thousands in misery, leaving only foundation stones and the occasional rusted artifact, physical remnants of a system that tried to erase its own existence. What remains are the testimonies, the ones that were finally spoken, finally recorded, finally believed, stories of survival that are also stories of profound loss, not just of years, but of identity, of the possibility of being fully known, of having one's suffering acknowledged by history. These are the Russian ghosts of war, not just the dead, but the living who were denied the right to their own stories, the witnesses who were silenced, the victims who were blamed, the survivors who were forgotten. Their haunting isn't supernatural. It's historical. It's the weight of truth that was deliberately suppressed, evidence that was systematically destroyed, memory that was officially forbidden. And their question echoes across the decades: if the victors write history, who writes the history of those who were erased from the victory? Who remembers the remembered when remembering itself becomes dangerous? The answer matters not just for the past, but for the present, because the mechanisms of state secrecy, the calculations about which truths are convenient and which are dangerous, the systems that can make people disappear while the world looks away, those didn't end with the Soviet Union. The Russian ghosts of war ask us to consider what other stories remain buried, what other truths are still deemed too inconvenient to acknowledge, what other ghosts are waiting, in sealed archives, in unmarked graves, in the memories of aging survivors who still fear to speak. In the Siberian permafrost, in the forests of Eastern Europe, in the bureaucratic labyrinths of classified documents, the evidence remains, fragments of a truth that refused to stay buried, testimony that couldn't be completely silenced, proof that memory, however suppressed, eventually surfaces. The camps may be gone, but the questions they raise remain, about what nations choose to remember, what they choose to forget, and whether truth can survive when history itself becomes a crime. These ghosts don't rest, because their stories aren't finished, because justice delayed for 70 years is justice still waiting, because somewhere, in an archive, in a memory, in the frozen ground, the evidence remains of what was done, and what was hidden and why. The secret files are opening, slowly, reluctantly, revealing operations that were never admitted, prisoners who were never acknowledged, crimes that were never prosecuted, truths that powerful nations on both sides of the Iron Curtain found convenient to leave buried. But the dead don't forget, and neither should we.